Morning to y'all who are here as well. We're going to continue this morning in Sunday school in Joshua chapter 10 primarily. Y'all remember chapter 9 was about a deception that took place, right? The people of Gibeon, which we find out later is like a royal city, meaning that it was a huge, wealthy, powerful city. And they fabricated a story. They put on, it was, can we say Bill Cosby anymore? We're going to get canceled. But back when I was a kid, there was an episode of the Bill Cosby Show in which Bill Cosby, who you remember was a doctor and is married to a lawyer, went to go buy a car, and his son came down dressed like a little rich kid. And he said, no, son, we're going to dress like hobos, essentially, to go buy the car, because we don't want to look like we have any money when we go buy the car. It was a very practical procedure there. He didn't want to get people's hopes up. That's kind of what Gibeon did. Gibeon pretended to be from a long way off, and that they had traveled under very ascetic conditions. They're put on worn-out sandals, worn-out bags, worn-out everything, and basically begged Joshua to make a covenant with them so that they would not be destroyed. And that subterfuge is found out. Discovered. They find out that these guys actually live in the same land. They are technically under the extermination mandate, and it puts Joshua between a rock and a hard place. Now, myself, I would not, given my context and my understanding of things, I consider that material misrepresentation. What happens? We have a real estate agent in here. What happens with material misrepresentation, Mrs. Johnson? You have at least avoidable contract at bare minimum, don't you? Right? So, but in their minds, they have made a contract with the person. They have made a covenant with the person. And the person is the person is the person, and you never know everything about the person anyway. And so they don't want to break their oath or their covenant that they sealed with the name of Yahweh to not destroy these people. So instead, they envassal them. They become, this great royal city is humbled and becomes servants of Israel. I think the hewers of wood and haulers of water. That particular one is another one that hits me kind of hard. I used to haul, Priscilla and I actually, used to haul about 5,000 gallons of water in the back of a truck every month. Well, our house in Spring Branch did not have water service. It's hard work, even with a truck and a 12-volt transfer pump. But that's what they were doing. Water is hard work, hauling that. But so that's what they were, and that was better. That was better than extermination. And so actually, that was a shrewd move by the leaders of Gibeon. And it's not presented in a judgmental way. So they're humbled, but not exterminated. So anyway, chapter 10 begins with a coalition, right? Now it came about when Adonai-Zedek, the Lord of righteousness, King of Jerusalem. It's an odd name for a Canaanite pagan king, isn't it? Adonai-Zedek, King of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, that he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all of its men were mighty. So if they can do all of this, right, this king is rightfully fearful. And you ought to understand that surrender was not actually an option. We're used to the westerns or the military movies where they say, give up now and you'll be spared. That was not an option for Joshua for the 7 nations. So they were obligated to do, politically, right, even a pagan king is obligated to act in the best interest of the people and at least give it a shot. Right? You wouldn't expect anything less. And so that's what he does. Therefore Adonai-Zedek, verse 3, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhiah, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. Remember, they're not actually going to attack Israel directly. I think they understand that that would be foolish. But going to attack their allies and their servants. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon and fought against it. So then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, Do not abandon your servants, come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. What is that number? Anybody remember what that number is? Roughly, to the 100,000s? 613,000 and some change, minus the 36 that got killed at Ai. So it's a fairly large group. When it says all of the warriors went, that's roughly how many. So you can imagine that is, last time I checked, there may be updated numbers, but that's roughly 2/3 or a little more of the size of the El Paso, the city of El Paso. And that's the size of the army that they're going into a land. Ken Carr would be embarrassed vicariously for me. I don't have a map up here. This is not a big piece of property, the promised land, especially the part that they're operating in right now. It's an impressive amount of people. 613,000 plus. And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. Why would you march all night if the Lord had given them into your hands? Anybody? Why would you work so hard? Okay, there might be some pragmatic consideration. Make sure that Gibeon knew that you were holding fast to the covenant you had made with them and protecting them. Okay, I hadn't thought of that one. Anybody else? Yeah, Lily? You're going to have to use your preacher voice, Lily. I didn't hear you. Fear that God was not going to deliver them? Maybe they realized. But they do have moments of weakness in their faith. They do not obey perfectly. Largely, the generation of Joshua did obey pretty well. And they proclaimed their faith on a pretty regular basis. We talked about this, that it was the generation of bricklayers was the one, and brick makers. Actually, they weren't bricklayers. Brick makers passed away in the desert to transition into a nation of warriors, right? And even, in Exodus, right, it says that Yahweh did not take them by the land of the Philistines here and there so that their hearts were not crushed, so that their hearts did not melt, so that they didn't get overly fearful. There's this progress, right, of development of valor and courage. And some of that is discipline, right? The fact that God has guaranteed you certain things does not mean that it's good for you to be lazy about embracing them, right? It's not good for the individuals involved. And so they act with discipline, they act with valor. I actually think that they were likely very eager to get there. We don't often think that it is, like in our culture, right, we question people who are overly eager to engage in combat or overly eager to engage in this kind of conflict. and that may be reasonable. I feel my grandfather spent probably most of the decade of the 60s in Vietnam, Special Forces, and I think there were two reasons for that. Likely he didn't want to live in the same home with my grandmother all that time. Personally speaking, it wasn't a good marriage. I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying what it was, and largely he liked it. He liked it, and I'm not sure that was a great thing psychologically for him. But these people are embracing God's promises and walking faithfully and doing what he says to do, and they're eager to do it. So I'm not sure that it necessarily was a command, but I think it was pretty hard to stop them. Plus, if Gibeon goes away, they have to start hauling their own firewood again, right? And their water. So, just something to consider as we go through. They marched all night. They were eager to do what God had for them to do. And they were all the more eager because God had promised to deliver these enemies into their hands. So Yahweh confounded them before Israel, verse 10, and he slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, Yahweh threw large stones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah, and they died. And there were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. We've noted Yahweh's creativity in honoring his promises in Canaan, in the promised land, right? Jericho was wholly different than all of the others. Jericho, they simply were supposed to march and yell. Yelling having spiritual impact, apparently, right? Every once in a while, people tell me I'm talking too loud. The Bible tells people to talk loud all the time, fairly regularly. And then Ai, they were supposed to go and take it, right? And they said, we just need a few thousand people. It's just a little city. And they got turned around due to sin in the camp, but then they took it. Another time, Yahweh tells them, hey, listen, engage in a little subterfuge, right? Actually deceive the city that you're going to take. Deceive the kings. And then ambush them. He's very creative, right? And that we talked about the nature that God actually commanded deception there, right? So we can't say blanket all of the people getting wound around the axle about certain people that preserved, especially Jewish people in the Scripture, by lying to people. Understand that God has commanded his people be delivered by deception at various points. And that was actually righteousness and obedience. So we can't just make a blanket statement there. But here, I just love it. I just threw large stones down from heaven to destroy the enemies. And more were killed. That wasn't just symbolic. When Scripture says the Lord is a warrior, that's not a allegorization, right? He actually comes and destroys his enemies. So then Joshua spoke to Yahweh in the day when Yahweh delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar, and the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day? There was no day like that before it or after it, when Yahweh listened to the voice of a man, for Yahweh fought for Israel. And then Joshua and all Israel had returned to the camp at Gilgal. He actually suspended the elliptical orbits of planetary bodies so that they would have a long enough time to engage their enemy. How many thousands of years did it take for us to develop the ability to do that, to engage the enemy in the dark? I believe Micah, remind me, what level of crime is it to allow a non-U.S. citizen to look through our current level of night vision? It's a felony. Yeah, you're not allowed to even let a commie look through a current night vision set right now that we're using because it took us that long to develop it for our own military. And I'm talking about actual commies, not the ones currently in Congress, the ones from, China, North Korea, that kind of thing. The ones who aren't embarrassed by it still. I'd say the ones currently there would still decline the title, the ones in Congress that we voted for. Anyway, let's continue. So they get whipped. That's the old-fashioned word for it. These 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah. 5 together, because they're real smart. 5 kings go hide in one cave. And it's told Joshua, saying, the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. And Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and assign men by it to guard them. Why do you roll a stone in front of a cave, children and adults? Children know this. Why do you roll a stone in front of a cave? Come on, think a little harder. Okay. Jesus. Yes. Thank you for the Sunday school answer. Yes. What are you creating out of a cave when you roll a stone in front of it? A tomb. God's very creative, right? They want to go hide in their tomb? Rock on. Go ahead. We'll lock you in there, and we'll let you kind of crock-pot, simmer on your behavior. Roll large stones against it, assign men by it to guard them, but do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for Yahweh your God has delivered them into your hand. So I want you to see the contrast, right? We've talked about that Joshua is not a king in a dynastic sense, but he is functioning as an ancient Near Eastern king in this record. He's the one leading the battle. He's the one strategizing. He's operating as the general of the army. And he's doing what is expected of the king of a nation, and the other 5 kings are hiding in a cave. But he's acting faithfully. Verse 20 says, it came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed. And the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. And no one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. There was no cowardice. Remember, that was actually a disqualification. God allowed people, if they had just built a house, if they had just got married, and if they were scared, to not go out to battle. That was unique among the armies of the world in all of history, right? Most armies in the world would shoot you for cowardice. In Israel, you weren't supposed to go because Israel's combat was not about numbers. It was not about whether you had enough people on the field. It was about whether the people on the field were walking faithfully before the Lord, embracing His promises. And they didn't need anybody who didn't have a spine. But nobody behaved in a way that would be criticized or cowardly. And Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, Adonai-Zedek, remember that. The king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And when they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near and put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. It's not customary for people to even be able to touch royal individuals, or even sometimes even to look at them. They were to be revered, sanctified, whatever. Remember that these are the kings of the Amorite peoples. Specifically, they're the ones that God told Abraham, you will not possess the land, but in the 4th generation, your descendants will return to the land because the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. So there's something more than just political victory going on here. This is a symbolism, a statement of who's God is winning, whose God is superior. If their God cannot deliver them even from the humiliation of essentially a commoner putting his sandals on the king of these cities' necks, he's useless. And so we have that, and that is a testimony to Israel. I would like to point out at this time that it is common to say that if you are in spiritual leadership of any entity, that you are required to be winsome. It doesn't work for you to speak harshly or directly. It doesn't work for you to speak critically, to use harsh language, or to confront people. You've got to be winsome. You have to be nice, is what they mean. I'm not sure if there's a nice way to put my foot on somebody's neck, but apparently at least one time, that was a valid exercise of spiritual leadership, right? At least once. This was a violation of protocol for the kings. So they came near and did that. Joshua then said to them, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus Yahweh will do to all your enemies with whom you fight." I imagine that there was somebody that was filled with some trepidation as he put his sandal on the neck of these enemy kings. He said, don't fear them. Do not fear retribution, at least. That's a common feature. It's actually central to the story of Esther. I don't know if you've made that connection, right? But Saul failed to kill Agag, the king. Samuel comes and remediates his error. It says there that he hacked Agag to pieces with a sword, while Agag had a smile on his face, thinking that it was past time. And then there's retribution brought. Who is Haman in the book of Esther? The Agagite. He's a descendant of Agag and still is seeking vengeance on the people who did such a thing to his ancestor. What Joshua essentially is telling them, don't fear that kind of retribution. That's not coming upon you, and this is going to be done over and over and over and over. He will do that to all of your enemies. So afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. So we have a little bit of an inversion there, don't we? What is the sign of being hung on a tree? Anyone? Biblically? Anybody remember? You're cursed. Yeah, you're not just dead. You're cursed, right? You talk about the nature of what the various instances of that mean, but you'll remember that Judas hung himself on a tree, right? Isaiah prophesies this regarding the Messiah, that he would be perceived of as cursed because he would be hung on a tree. The tradition goes way back. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. They simply perfected it. They were a brutal empire in this regard. But it was a sign that you did not care about retribution. That you did not care about retribution, because not only were you killing kings of the land, in the land here, you are condemning them to the worst possible way of dying that they could imagine at the time. And you did not care what came after. They hung them on the trees until evening, and it came about. They got put in their tomb before they got hung on the tree. That's the inversion I was talking about, right? Normally you get hung on the tree and then you get put in your tomb, and they rolled a stone there. Anyway, interesting note in the narrative. It came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command. They took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave. So back they go to this very day. Now Joshua captured Makkedah on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Thus he did to the king of Makkedah just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Verse 29, then Joshua and all Israel with him passed from Makkedah to Libnah and fought against Libnah. Yahweh gave it also with its king into the hands of Israel. And he struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. Thus he did to its king, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. Then Yahweh gave Lachish into the hands of Israel, and he captured it on the second day and struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done to Libnah. You're going to catch a pattern here, right? One of the reasons that I do this the way I do it is so that if you're reading along and you attend Sunday school, then at the end of a book, you can at least say, I read that book, right? There are details here that we don't get the way that Sunday school is normally taught. We like to skip to the action shots, right? Not the narrative. So then Horam, king of Gazer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua defeated him and his people until he had left him no survivor. And Joshua and Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and they camped by it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed that day every person who was in it, according to all that he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua and all Israel went up with him from Eglon to Hebron. They fought against it. They captured it and struck its king and all its cities and all the persons who were in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor, according to all he had done to Eglon, and he utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to Debir, and they fought against it. He captured its king and all its cities, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed every person who was in it. He left no survivor, just as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir and its king, as he had also done to Libnah and its king. Then Joshua struck all the land, the hill country, the Negev, the lowland, the slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as Yahweh, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, even as far as Gaza and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. And Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time, because Yahweh, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. I would like to point out, aside from the repetition, right, the repetition is designed to impress upon you the ordinariness of victory for Joshua. He simply had to engage and he was granted victory. It is supposed to be memorable because it is so painfully repetitive, right? Anybody? That's the idea. It is supposed to be seared into your memory that there was no place that Joshua went that he didn't have victory over his enemies, did not utterly destroy them, did not utterly destroy the king, and feared no retribution from any of his enemies. That is remarkable, right? If you read the context of battles that were fought outside of this land and outside of this context, it takes, even for a small town, a small walled city-state in this time, it took months of siege, most of the time, because the time was conflict-ridden. There was not a prosperity decree. There wasn't, right? Israel said, look, you wipe out the people in the land, you're going to have no problems with prosperity. You're going to have plenty of money, plenty of food, plenty of babies, plenty of livestock. Your houses are going to be in great shape. You didn't build them. But you're going to live in them. It's going to be your heritage forever. But in the world at large, normally speaking, prosperity has not been the norm. And one of the primary ways you would build wealth was simply to go take it from somebody. That's how that worked. And so they were all fortified. The cities were fortified to withstand people trying to take their stuff. Oddly enough, they did build a wall around most of those cities. We can't figure out that we ought to build a wall around our border. But that's neither here nor there, because that's not in Joshua, right? But that's the idea. At least slow them down a little bit. Give us some time to get our stuff together. So it is remarkable, all of these, to take them in a day or two, every single time, over and over and over, as the people are fortified and prepared for you, as they've been hearing that you were coming. They had been hearing that Israel was coming to take their stuff right out from under them for 40 years plus. They heard the day, virtually, because this isn't very far from Egypt. We need to get the maps out, I guess. We need to look. Within a week, I'm sure that they heard that Pharaoh's army was under the Red Sea in Canaan and that Israel was coming. And they had been hearing that for 40 years. They had had 40 years to fortify, 40 years to prepare, 40 years to hope and pray that they were wrong, that they would die in the desert, that their bodies would drop dead, and that they would not have enough provisions or enough sustenance to be formidable. And now here they are. They crossed the Jordan the same way they crossed the Red Sea. Joshua stood in the middle of it. The waters parted. They parted miles upstream. People for miles and miles and miles had a witness to how Israel entered the land on dry land across the Jordan. There was nothing standing before them. Nothing. And you're supposed to remember that, even if you don't remember the name Eglon. You remember the other Eglon, right? That's in Judges. Eglon was the king, and Ehud killed him. But Eglon was also a city. He leaves no survivor, because that's what he was commanded to do. So then Joshua and all Israel, let's see, am I skipping a verse here? I'm not, am I? No. Just as he had done to the king of Jericho. I'm telling you, it's repetitive at this point. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed from Makkedah to Libnah. Did I already read that section? 29? I did. I finished 10. Why is my page scrolled then? That's what I want to know. This computer gets funny with the touch screen. Every once in a while, it just starts scrolling itself. Did it in the middle of one of my PhD presentations. That was exciting. Anyway, so verse 1 of chapter 11. Then it came about. We got about 10 minutes, maybe a little less. When Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard of it, he sent to Jobab. That's the first hillbilly king of Canaan. Cousin's name is Jobab, but this is Jobab, the king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, and the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who are of the north in the hill country and in the Arabah, south of Kinneroth, and in the lowland and on the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. Remember, that was the heavy weaponry of the day. They were moving quite a bit of it out on Fort Bliss this last Monday when we were going to get our butts kicked by some very dangerous bees. Went around and they were moving a lot of heavy equipment around. And that was the equivalent. Some of them were armored, but there was not even a ratio, right? So the ratios we're used to, right, are essentially infantry. How many guys with shields, spears, and swords do you have versus how many guys with shields, spears, and swords do you have? If you have 40,000 and they have 10,000, then you win, right? This was the theory of why we should be cautious about communist China for decades and decades and decades, and probably still holds true, that they could give everybody a pitchfork and we would run out of bullets, like if it was that kind of war. That's not the kind of war it will be when it comes. But that has been always the concern. But there is actually no ratio. There was no infantry in this day that would face chariots, especially not iron chariots. If you had even a reasonable number of chariots, everybody fled because nothing they could do would deal with your army, with your chariots. It was technologically impossible. It would be like those episodes of the original Star Trek series, right, where you show up on a culture that's still hunting with flintlocks. This was one particular episode, right? And you show up with a starship. You win. That's how it is. So they did that. There's this as the sand of the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Then Yahweh said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." Impossible, right? like pragmatically. Every other army in the world would flee before an army like this. Egypt was the greatest nation in the ancient Near East, probably in the world at the time, and they would have a hard time with an army like this. Of course, they had not too long ago lost all of their chariots, but they probably had replaced them by now. When you're told that, you must have had precedent to believe God, to have victory over and over and over. And that's part also of the record that we've just read. God has never misled them. You will hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. In other words, you will rip the motors out of their vehicles and they will just lie still before you. That's what's going to happen. They won't even be able to ride them afterwards. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Misrephoth-Maim and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. So Joshua did to them as Yahweh had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all these kingdoms. So they struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. You might ask, why? Why did God want them to get rid of all that wealth and all that technology? They didn't have the technology to make the chariots, I don't think, at this point. But they burned them all, and they killed all the horses. I know we have some horse people here. That's just not a nice thing to consider. Horses, the more intelligent the animal, the more difficult it is to consider, right? That sort of thing. I've always, joked with my daughter that we can't have a horse because it's hard to find someone to process them. In most of the world, they're edible livestock animals. In the United States, we consider them just big rabbits, little big fluffies, right? Why would they do that? Anybody remember a relevant promise given to Joshua that might affect why God wanted them to continue to use infantry to do this? Rather than chariots, rather than Canaanite chariots. Anybody? What was Joshua told when he entered the land? It was actually the same thing that God told Abraham, which I find unique. He told Joshua, everywhere you set your foot, you will possess. Not everywhere you rode somebody else's chariot on. You're going to trust me. Your army is not going to be how you win. Your faithfulness to me and obedience to me and I will go to war for you. I will fight your battles for you. Everywhere you set your foot, you will possess it. So it is a symbol to the other peoples, I think, in Canaan as to the dependence that they had on God's promise and God's warriorship on behalf of Israel. We don't need your stuff to beat you. Make sense? Anybody? All right. Something to keep in mind as we go. There are principles, right? We are not told to go out and find our spiritual Canaan to seize as a church. But the theological principles are that God can be trusted far beyond our capacity to reason how it could possibly be. Is significant to us. So they struck every person who was in it, utterly destroying them. No one left who breathed. He burned Hazor with fire. Verse 12, Joshua captured all the cities of these kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. These are not burial mounds. They are, what would you call them? Landmarks. So the cities that were on the trade route that went all the way from Egypt into Assyria essentially had mounds that the cities were built on so that they could be observed to be navigated towards. And Joshua determined that it would be better to maintain those trade routes. Remember that the promise of the kingdom that was given to Israel was that the nations of the earth would stream to them ultimately. And so they are keeping those routes open. But as a sign to the people, the greatest of those cities, Joshua did burn Hazor. Remember that he said that was the central city of all this coalition. So all the spoil of these cities and the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as Yahweh had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that Yahweh had commanded Moses. Thus Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all the Negev, all that land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel, and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, which is in Edom, right, even as far as Baal-gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. And Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. In other words, it was not a small feat, even acting faithfully. It took time. God had explained why that was the case, why he wouldn't just send in an ancient version of COVID, right, and wipe out everybody so that he could just put Israel into the land. The reason was because there weren't enough Israelites to keep it from going wild, right? It doesn't take very long for my backyard to do this, right? We get a little bit of rain, unseasonable in May, and all of a sudden I've got those 6-foot tumbleweeds. They're green, but we have to release the goats, right? Because it's not even, there's a lot of calories in those things. I mean, we could chop them and burn them. But it doesn't take very long. And so Joshua explained to them, you guys are going to take it little by little. You're going to wage war. You're going to take it as you can occupy it and keep it from reverting to wilderness, like the ones you've been wandering around in your whole lives. So it was an effort. It was a lifetime worth of work here. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of Yahweh to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country. Who are the Anakim? Anybody? You know the term Nephilim. They're related, right? Nephilim and Anakim. They're the actual giants. That's what, when the spies come back and they report, the 12 spies went out and 10 came back and said, we were as grasshoppers in their sight. I don't think they were lying. I think they looked straight up at the giants in the land. The way people look at me in Walmart in El Paso. Oh, I hope he's nice. I am nice. But anyway, I'm the nicest mean person anybody'd ever meet. Anyway. So he goes after the giants from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. Even the giants didn't stand a chance. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. By the way, how did these giants, this is a question for you. I think I have an answer, but how did giants reoccur after the flood? By the way, anyone ever thought about this? When do you see the Nephilim? You remember the Nephilim? The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they went into them. And that is after that God sees that the wickedness of man is perpetual. It's horrible, and it has to be destroyed. So were they all destroyed by a universal flood? Some people that say they're taking the Bible seriously say, no, it wasn't really that universal. We understand it to be universal. We understand it to be the entire world was covered in water, and every living thing, every human certainly, and every animal that walked on the face of the planet was preserved in the ark, as Scripture says. So how did giants reoccur? Oh, we're over time. Y'all just think about this next week. If you're here next week, give me your theological answer, your biblical answer. We'll discuss it. Sorry for going over. I didn't go over once till I hit my 40s, and now I'm turning into an old, verbose man, apparently. I don't know what's going on here. I'm going nuts. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. We thank you for your word and for the faithfulness of Joshua, for the example that he set for generations of leaders and kings, prophets, priests, all of them in the future to come, and the generations that were to follow him. Father, and even for the pattern that it sets for our expectation of what God intended in his promise of a kingdom for Israel. We thank you for that, and we love you. Thank you for the life that we have in your Son by grace through faith, and it's in his name we pray. Amen.